Hello, Professor Hankinson here, and this is the second lecture for topic 2 that looks at the public policy process. Okay, so what are we going to be looking at in this lecture? Well, we're going to be taking a look at the policy making process, and we're going to be using Title IX, which is the law that prohibits sex discrimination in education, as a case study. So, as we learned in the last lecture, that policymaking is a product of politics. And so the question is how is policy made? Well, if you took a regular or a more general public policy class, you would see that you would study many different models for how public policy is made. But we're going to just look at one model, which is a good starting point. And the model that we're going to take a look at is what is known as the policy making process, or also just sometimes known as the policy process. And this model sees policy making as a predictable political activity with well-established steps. And that's why we start there. It's sort of like a very straightforward, like this is how, like the most idealistic world, this is how public policy is made. So that's where we're going to start. So let's take a look at the steps. Okay, so let's take a look at the different steps involved in the policy process. The first step is called problem identification and agenda setting. Well, what does that mean? Well, the first step in making public policy is like identifying a problem that's taking place within society. Okay. And so it really could be anything, and that problem identification could really come from anyone. Could come from a constituent who's looking at their community and saying, wow, I really see that there seems to be a lot of teen pregnancies in my community. This seems to be a problem. Maybe it needs to be addressed, right? So problem identification is the first step. And it's where individuals and groups demand government to address a problem. And one of the ways they get them to address that problem is by getting that problem on lawmakers' agenda. Okay. And so agenda setting is trying to focus the attention of the mass media and public officials on a specific policy problem. And there's lots of different ways that you can do that. You could try to set the agenda by writing letters to your members of Congress. You could try to get some news coverage on your agenda. You could engage in direct action, protests to draw attention to that, hoping that it was going to get on the agenda of lawmakers, those who make policy. So that's the first step. The second step is policy formation and legitimation. And what policy formation is the development of the law, or the formation of the public policy that you hope will be enacted. And that can take place by different groups. Sometimes members of the White House will work to craft language for public policy, and then they'll give it to lawmakers and of their party and say, let's work on passing this into law. You can have members of Congress themselves that do that. Interest groups will sometimes formulate policy, give to a lawmaker in hopes of getting passed, etc. So policy formation is working out the details of this bill or pre-law, right, that you hope gets passed. And legitimation is when the law is actually enacted, right? And so Congress will pass the law, but then the law will get enacted in terms of being signed by the president. But it also is fully enacted when it's deemed, if there's a question about the constitutionality of the law, when the Supreme Court weighs in on whether or not this law and policy is constitutional. We saw that with the Affordable Care Act. We saw that with abortion laws, etc. So that legitimation process is signing it into law with the president, but the court's weighing in to say whether or not these are in fact constitutional. Policy implementation is a really large step. A lot of times the policy, once it's passed, it can be kind of vague. And so then they hand it off to the federal bureaucracy or the state bureaucracy if it's a state level law. And like the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Justice or the Department of Education, whatever is related to that, the public policy, they actually take that policy and they put it into action. Okay. They figure out the actual nuts and bolts of implementing the law. And then the last step is policy evaluation. After the policy is implemented, then it gets critiqued, it gets evaluated. Um, uh, the government itself can look at whether or not the job is addressing the problem effectively, and if not, how the law should be amended in order to make it work better. You could have the general public or the media do that, members of think tanks and interest groups that are interested in issues like healthcare or abortion rights or whatever, minimum wage law, whatever it might be. And so, in the policy evaluation is a critique of how well the policy is working, and then it kind of circles back to number one, where it's sort of like, hey, we have this law in place, but we've identified a problem with this law, and so we would like to amend it and go through the process again. So that, in a nutshell, is looking at the steps associated with the policy making process. Okay, so I said that we were going to be using Title IX as a case study to help us bring the policy process to light. In order to do that, let's just talk a little bit about what Title IX is. We're going to be learning about this later in the semester, but let's talk about what Title IX is and how it impacts our lives. Well, Title IX is an amendment to the Higher Education Act of 1965. And it's basically the law, you're probably familiar with it. It's the law that prohibits sex discrimination in any school that is receiving federal funding. Okay. So basically, it is an expansion of civil rights laws as it relates to education. And there's just the wording of Title IX. I'll put it up there. You could take a pause and take a look at it. But like I said, we're going to be going into detail with Title IX and a lot more later in the semester when we get to the topic on education. How does it, Title IX impact our lives? In other words, why is it important? Well, it impacts our lives because it basically says that students and employees cannot be subject to discrimination. Student employees of any institution of education that gets federal fundings can't be subject to discrimination due to their gender, due to their pregnancy, marital status, parenthood. Before Title IX, a woman or a man who applied to a school could be rejected in the admissions process because of their gender. Women would be rejected from law school. Men would be rejected from nursing school and teaching school as well. And so Title IX brings that kind of discrimination to an end. You probably heard about Title IX because one of the impacts of Title IX is that it led to having gender equity in sports. And so the thinking was that a lot of the scholarships go to sports that guys play. And Title IX said, well, you have to sort of have equal scholarships, right? That you have to open up sports opportunities for women in order for them to have the same equal accessibility to playing sports, but also getting scholarships for sports. After Title IX was passed, one of the ways it was expanded was amending Title IX to make sure that schools must address sexual violence and sexual harassment. And that was in part with the Violence Against Women's Act that we'll be learning about later on in the semester. And so basically, because if you go to a school and it's filled with sexual violence, you fear for your safety, then you really can't get equal access to education. So schools, it's sort of discriminatory. So schools need to address sexual violence in order to be in compliance with Title IX. And most recently, Title IX has been expanded to cover not just discrimination as it relates to sex and gender, but it's been expanded to include transgender students also. That gender identity or gender nonconforming folks cannot be discriminated against. But I have ... maybe because things changed under the Trump administration. So under the Obama administration, in terms of the implementation of Title IX, they directed public schools to allow students to use bathrooms that align with their gender identity. When Trump got into office, his Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, along with Attorney General, they rescinded that guidance and basically said that they left it to schools themselves to decide the kinds of protections that transgender and gender nonconforming students would receive. So that's really kind of a good example of the ways in which laws are implemented and how different administrations can implement laws in different ways. Okay, so let's look at the first step of the policy making process with problem identification and the agenda. And so, as I stated before, that individuals and groups demand that government addresses a problem or an issue. And your public policy textbook relates to that as a policy debate. It's like an argument over an issue, right? And that is part of what identifies problems, but then also allows it to get it on the agenda. And your textbook also talks about this thing called a policy community, which is a network of political actors that try to raise awareness about an issue and try to get it on the agenda. And so this happens through focusing attention on the media, on public interest groups, on public officials, trying to get them aware of the problem. How did that play itself out with Title IX? In Title IX, Title IX was a response to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there were prohibitions against discrimination when it came to race and sex, when it came to employment. But Civil Rights Act of 1969 only prohibits racial discrimination in schools, but it doesn't go as far as prohibiting gender discrimination. There was a lot more buy-in that people shouldn't be discriminated when it comes to education based on their race. There wasn't as much buy-in, again, the historical context and sort of the values of the time, that there was sort of this, when it came to education, that maybe it was better to have separate, classrooms for boys and girls, or maybe it made sense to prohibit certain kinds of people, men, from pursuing certain kinds of fields like nursing and teaching. So it was the Civil Rights Act that is sort of spurs the problem identification and the policy debate. The thinking is the policy debate is, wait a second, is treating women differently in education justified? And the debate, ensues, and the thinking is, no, it's not justified. That we need to end sexual discrimination of federal funding in educational institutions. And then a policy community kind of develops around the answer to that debate question about that sex discrimination is not justified. And so you get groups like the National Organization of Women who start coalescing around this issue of education equality, and also the Women's Equity Action League. And so they start raising awareness about this and getting it on the policy agenda. And then you have activists and lawmakers such as Bernice Sanders and Representative Edith Green and Patsy Mink and also Senator Birch Bayh, all are kind of get on board as part of this policy community that is demanding change. So here's just some pictures of Bernice Sanders and then the National Organization of Women marching on the issue of educational equality. Bernice Sanders is interesting because she was applied for admissions to 20 different schools, and that actually I've got that wrong. It was Patsy Minks from Hawaii who applied to 20 different medical schools. and was denied admissions. Bernice Sanders, she was wanting to move up to be full professor, and they denied her that because of her gender. And they said that she came off as being too strong for a woman, and she sued as well. And so both of those are sort of examples of this people taking action, suing in order to get a perceived problem on the agenda. The next step is that formulation and legitimation. Again, just as a reminder, the formation is the creation of the law or the public policy by lawmakers, interest groups, think tanks, and the legitimation of that is the enactment of policy by Congress, the president, and the courts. How did that play itself out for Title IX? Well, it was introduced as an amendment to the Higher Education Act of 1965. So there was an existing act that was on the books, and Senator Birchby from Indiana presented that amendment, that the language of Title IX saying that people can't be discriminated against in educational facilities on the basis of sex. And it was passed by Congress, and it had really strong support. This was a time period, and we're going to be learning about this later on, where issues of gender equality, support for the Equal Rights Amendment, and even support for abortion, it didn't break down along party lines like the way that it does today. You had Republicans and Democrats who supported this act, obviously. It passed 88-6 in the Senate and 275 to 125 in the House. And that not only that, but it's signed into law by President Nixon, a Republican, in June of 1972. And so, that's that formation and legitimation. Here you see the two lawmakers, Edith Green and Patsy Minks, who are co-authored drafts with Birchby of the Title IX language. And there is a picture of President Nixon signing it into law. Okay, and so the final two steps in the process are the policy implementation. And so just to remind you of what that is, that's where the policy is realized via the federal or state bureaucracies. Money is allocated from the budget in order to pay for the implementation of this new public policy. And this is where the details are worked out about putting public policy into force. And it's a crucial step in the policymaking process. And that fourth step is the question of policy evaluation. Is the policy working? And it's the analysis of policy post-implementation of the law. Okay, so how did this play itself out with Title IX? Well, the policy implementation aspect of Title IX was really quite important because the amendment to the Higher Education Act that brings about the education acts that bring about Title IX, it was a pretty short amendment, and that it really, there was a lot that the federal bureaucracies needed to do to really bring this policy into implementation. And so it was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is today, that department doesn't exist anymore within the federal bureaucracy. Today, it's the Department of Health and Human Services and a separate department called the Department of Education. Today is the Department of Education's job for continued implementation of Title IX. And so they took that law and then they asked themselves, how is this going to be implemented? And it was a tough job because while there was widespread acceptance that there should be gender equality and no gender discrimination in secondary and higher education, there are questions about, how is that going to play itself out? There were questions about whether textbooks needed to be evaluated to see whether textbooks were reinforcing gender stereotypes and were promoting sort of discriminatory attitudes towards men or women. They decided not to do that in terms of its implementation. But when it came to scholarships and sports, there was a lot of discussion about what role should football play, etc., and that decisions were made in terms of that. So those are just some examples of the way in which Title IX was implemented. And the last step of the policy process is the policy evaluation. In other words, impacting what has been the impact of Title IX. has it successfully reduced gender discrimination or eliminated gender discrimination in education? Has it achieved its goals? Has it fallen short? Are there any unintended consequences of Title IX? And so, one of the things that, through the policy evaluation of Title IX that was indicated was that universities did a really good job on getting rid of sexual discrimination as it came to admissions into colleges. But once you were in college, that the environment in the college campus was in itself sort of discriminatory, in particular because through the evaluation, it was discovered that universities were not going far enough and doing a good enough job addressing sexual harassment and violence on their campuses. And so changes were made to Title IX that mandated that colleges needed to do reporting out of how much violence was going on. And if there was violence, they need to address that violence and make changes, because it's discriminatory to people based on sex if they don't feel safe on their campus because they're going to be assaulted or harassed because of their sex. Another unintended consequence that was the adverse impact that it had on men's sports. And so I don't know if I've already mentioned this, but my family members on my husband's side, they were played wrestling at the NCAA level. And whenever we get together, they're always bemoaning Title IX, and there's some truth to it, because as equity was trying to be made between men and women's sports, some of the less popular sports, like men's wrestling, began to get cut or funding cut in order to provide parity and not have to mess with the football program. Okay. And so those are just some examples of the policy evaluation. Okay. Thanks for listening. And if you have questions, let me know, and I'd be happy to go over them with you.